Howdy y'all, and welcome to Political Us. Carefully eluding the conversation about race is part of American history. In 1776, when creating the Declaration of Independence, it could have been addressed, but the colonists needed the southern states. Time and time again, America has had the chance to address racism, but hasn't. America, how'd you get so racist? This is Context with Chris. Because race in America is a complicated personal discussion, we're going to stick strictly to federal and state laws that have had direct impacts on the racial divide of America. And while police brutality and accountability are the main talking points of today's outcries, we're going to treat it as a result of the laws and not a cause of the divide. The same goes for protests, riots, looting, vandalism, white supremacy, and anything else that's done by individuals. The same will go for massacres like Tulsa and Charleston. We're looking at laws that enabled or outlawed personal bias. Because of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail for some of these. I cut a few items like affirmative action, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 that may have had more impactful changes near them. If you'd like to find out more, I encourage you to leave a question in the comments section. One final note, if I can ask one thing, please share this video. Share it now before another unarmed Black American is killed and we start the cycle all over again. All right, let's just start after the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. Here's how most American history stops with the Civil War. The slaves were free. The 13th Amendment, blacks were given the same opportunities as whites, and if they didn't succeed in life, well, it's because they were lazy, uneducated criminals that live in a culture of violence and have no respect for authority. However, that is where today's racism forms. America switched from blacks being property to blacks being unequal, and that's a big difference. Before, lawmakers and white Americans looked at blacks the same way as we might look at a house or a pet today. Slaves were investments or companions, but also replaceable. All that had changed. Now they had to be treated equal. While they were free, the law said nothing about equal. And soon, both federal and local governments begin exploiting that. There's reasons the beacon on the shining hill suddenly disappears from children's history books. This conversation is about historical equality amongst blacks and whites. To track that, here's our life starting line. This line is not scientific or going to apply to everyone. It's purely a representation. Fight about its accuracy in the comments. Let's add not addressing slavery in the Declaration of Independence, the 13th Amendment, and population size of 1860. Why? Because that's the advantage of being the majority. There's simply more white people voting than brown. Immediately after the Civil War, southern states began enacting black codes. The codes varied from state to state, but were legal actions taken against blacks to limit their independence and freedoms. These clearly racist, separate laws blacks had to follow are where the seeds of modern racism are planted. The idea that more blacks commit crimes started here. Blacks could go to jail if they didn't have written approval that they were employed, fined if they worked anything as other than a farmer, or if they carried a firearm. It's easy to see how today's racist beliefs about not complying and being criminals got their start. Would you comply if you were arrested for looking at someone for too long? Black codes. In late 1865, Congress set out to address black codes with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The act accomplished three primary objectives: grant birthright citizenship, define the rights of American citizenship, and criminalize depriving these rights because of race, color, or prior condition of slavery. President Johnson did try to veto the bill, which will matter later, but the bill was approved through Congress. For beginning racial trends, white America gets one step ahead for the black codes. Black America, half a step for the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Why only half? Because it was primarily a reaction to anger at the southern states for not complying after the Civil War and creating black codes. Now, let's add a full step for arguably the most impactful of all amendments, the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, covered quite a few concerns, but the biggest for this conversation is its attempt at equality and punishing treason. Yeah, it's weird how laws are combined. Section 1 is a more direct version of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and is more inclusive than the black and white of that act. It's why it's used so much for equality debates even to this day. Section 3 prevented traitors from holding public office, which was important at the time because it prevented former Confederate soldiers and officers from controlling governmental seats and making laws. 2 years later, in 1870, we get more good news for equality. First, the 15th Amendment is ratified, protecting black men's right to vote. Sorry, women, you have to wait 3 more years because America. Second, the Enforcement Acts were signed into law. The Enforcement Acts sent federal troops to the South to ensure all the laws for equality were being enforced. But I hear you say, aren't all police officers good and uphold the law? No. The Enforcement Acts were necessary because states weren't following the principles of the law and local police officers weren't enforcing them anyways. But more on the blind eye of the police later. For our live starting line, +1 for the 15th Amendment and +1 more for the Enforcement Acts, the real force behind the other amendments and laws. Alright, it's 1870 and we're feeling pretty good, right? Laws are in place for equality. Other than the disparity in the population, if black Americans aren't successful now, well, it's because they were lazy, uneducated criminals that live in a culture of violence and have no respect for authority. No, there's more. The first of many strikebacks against equality is passed with the Amnesty Act of 1872. Remember those Confederate soldiers that created treason against America and fought for states' rights to continue slavery? Well, this act just let them run for office again. The bill didn't erase or amend Section 3 of the 15th Amendment, but it did give a blanketed pardon to all Confederate soldiers. Plus half for the Amnesty Act of 1872, this move sets in motion the ability for Southern races to regain state and federal power. Okay, are you ready to have your mind blown?
Boom, you looking for this?
In 1875, Congress enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This law required that all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances of land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, subject only to the conditions and limitations established by law and applicable alike to citizens of every race and color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. Did you catch that? In 1875, a United States law was enacted that legally outlawed discrimination in America. In 1875. That's it. That's the finish line. Legally, no more discrimination in America. Time to celebrate. Let's take away the Black Codes and Civil Rights Act of 1875. You get all the steps. Now you're probably thinking, if the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is a thing, why is there still more video? If black Americans aren't successful now, well, it's because they're lazy, uneducated criminals that live in a culture of violence and have no respect for authority, right? Not so fast, my friend. There are 2 actions taken by the government that destroy all of the good vibe. The Compromise of 1877, aka the Great Betrayal, was the first strike back. To simplify, in 1876, during the extremely close presidential election between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes, a deal was made that removed federal troops from the South, the ones sent to enforce the amendments and civil rights acts we've just discussed. With no one enforcing the laws, including police officers, they essentially became worthless. The second massive blow to equality in America, the civil rights cases of 1883. The Supreme Court ruled in an 8-1 vote that neither the 13th or 14th Amendment was infringed by uncodified racial discrimination and couldn't be constitutionally protected. Meaning, because the laws weren't specific enough, the amendments didn't protect individual rights. And with that ruling, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were taken at their literal word. With the spirit of the laws ignored and no one to enforce them anyways, all that had been gained for equality was gone, just like that. It was a reset. Imagine the heartbreak of being a former slave at that point. In 20 years, you've gone from being less than human to equal and back to less than human, and from your own community. Take away the steps for the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875. Take away the Enforcement Acts and cut the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in half. What they originally meant was downgraded, and with no enforcement, bring back the Black Codes. We're essentially back to right after the Civil War. Black Americans lost all progress. Southern, racist, white Americans essentially went unpunished. Welcome to the era of Jim Crow, separate but equal, and terrorism in the black community. Folks, this part ain't in your history books. For 95 million Americans alive today, Jim Crow laws aren't just history. They lived or grew up during them. Their parents were part of the group who wholeheartedly believed whites were superior to blacks just because of skin color. This isn't history, this is now. After the Supreme Court stripped away the Civil Rights Acts, Jim Crow laws exploded unchallenged across former Confederate states. Labeled by some as second slavery, many Jim Crow laws were just like the Black Codes, except they weren't created and enforced by defeated Confederates. These laws were done by people who were angry at having the federal government force them to treat property like human. For example, in 1901, John B. Knox, president of the Alabama Constitutional Convention, opened with, "Why, it is within the limits imposed by the federal Constitution to establish white supremacy in this state." I don't know he said it that way, but I bet he did. To understand how racist and vengeful these laws were, here's a list of some of them. Also during this time, the famous 1896 Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson reiterated what the court in 1883 ruled. Separate but equal was the new law of the land, and really would be for 60 more years. Separate but equal is anything but. The more appropriate title would have been separate and less. There were very few instances where it was truly equal, especially when it came to maintenance. Poll taxes were also imposed during this time, mainly in the southern, former Confederate states. Surprise, surprise. The goal was to limit the black vote by requiring the poor community to pay a tax to vote. And maybe you're thinking, that's not racist, it's a registration to vote. There's two main reasons you'd have to be naive or racist to overlook. First, their enforcement was at the discretion of the election official. The election official decided on an individual basis who they wanted to check. And in racially charged areas, who do you think they were checking? Second, the idea that blacks during Jim Crow even remotely had the same jobs at the same pay is laughable. For many blacks, any extra tax was a financial burden. That's why they were created in the first place. +1 for Jim Crow laws, +1 for separate but equal, and +1 for poll taxes. And +2 because this is where the arguments of modern racism fertilize their roots. The main talking points of today's races, whether it be crime, poverty, education, or violence, are planted early in American history. But the Jim Crow era, a time frame that almost 1/3 of living Americans were alive during, fertilized those seeds and planted them deep into American roots. One thing that has to be discussed is the terrorism and murders that happened during the Jim Crow era. According to a report from the Equal Justice Initiative, during the Jim Crow era, in the 12 most offendable states, almost 4,000 people were lynched. That's purely lynched, not murdered, kidnapped, beaten, or harassed, purely lynched. And while we think these were done in the dark by a few outlaws, they were spectacles. Just look at these photos. Blacks were killed for things like entering a room where 3 white women were sitting, referring to a police officer by his name without the title of Mr., or inviting a white woman to have a drink. While we could talk the disgusting actions of the Jim Crow era forever, this episode is about laws and not individual actions. To learn more, I'll add a link to the Equal Justice Initiative in the description. One of the findings from the report will help us transition to our next topic. The lynchings and terror happening in the South, as well as unfair labor practices like sharecropping, were a major reason for the Great Migration. The Great Migration from 1916 to 1970 was the relocation of more than 6 million African Americans from the rural South to the rest of the country. Driven from their homes, many blacks took advantage of the need for industrial workers that arose during the First and Second World Wars. If you look at where African Americans went, you'll see some very familiar cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Los Angeles, and Oakland that always seem to make their way into conversations about race because racist. Some interesting things happened for Black America at this point. First, to clarify, the reaction to the migration wasn't any different than today. Those making the migration came with hopeful aspirations for a better life for their families. Those in the cities with an increase of migrants worried about their own livelihoods. So in other words,
they took our jobs! They took our jobs!
Even though Jim Crow laws weren't as prevalent in the North, racism and discrimination still existed. Remember, at this point, separate but equal is the law of the land. Blacks didn't escape that by moving north. There was still discrimination over pay, housing, school, and daily activities. To escape that, many Black communities started to be created within the migrant cities. Here, businesses, schools, housing, and jobs centered around Blacks. And underneath all of that were the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, which we'll get to shortly. The Great Migration gets a point. While spread over 6 decades, in the grand scheme of time, this is a massive shift of culture. In the span of a lifetime, Black culture went from mainly in the South to throughout the whole country. Which leads us to another critical moment of racism in America, the beginning of modern racism, where laws and policies begin to be equal in writing but unequal in practice. Let's talk about the 12 years of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's complicated impact on the Black community. First, I need to preference something we've seen before, the importance of winning the South at the expense of the Black community. We saw it at the American Revolution, during Reconstruction, at the compromise between Hayes and Tilden, and we're going to see it here again with Roosevelt. President Roosevelt won 4 elections, winning all former Confederate states each time. That's unprecedented, and it happened because he, just like those before him, sacrificed the Black community for the greater good. Assuming office as America attempted to rebound from the Great Depression, Roosevelt faced an America that was poor, just dirt poor. And to way oversimplify it, one strategy to regain the economy was investing in America with the New Deal. Dozens of programs centered around jobs, housing, wages, and industries. While many of these programs were directed at America's poor, and they seemed to be equally available to all, because these programs weren't specific enough, states and companies could still discriminate against the Black community. Even though at the time, Black unemployment was double of white unemployment, because Blacks had been the first to be let go, when job opportunities became available, it was whites that got them. Roosevelt did something we see many Americans do today. He talked about great inclusive ideas, all lives matter or I don't see color, but not the controversial main issue preventing those great ideas, racism. Overall, Roosevelt's years for this exercise get no points. His policies improved America as a whole, and while Black Americans could benefit from these programs, they could also be legally discriminated from them as well. And now it's time to discuss the biggest current issue with racism in America. It all stems from one single action taken by Roosevelt's federal government during the New Deal: redlining. Have you ever noticed how cities across America, regardless of geography or size, tend to have, or at least had, different sections? I'm sure the town you grew up in probably had a, once you go past here, this is where blank lives. That segregation isn't by chance or selection. It's a result of the Federal Housing Administration and a process it used called redlining. And when you talk about redlining, white America automatically gets 1 step for the practice of redlining and 2 steps for its devastating long-term effect on equity for minorities. Hear me again, equity, not equality. Here's how it worked and why it was detrimental to not only the Black community, but all minorities, and why we still have the effects of it today. During the New Deal, the FHA and Homeowners Loan Corporation mapped out each metropolitan area across the country. They color-coded different sections of the map to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere near Black people or other minorities was redlined and considered too risky to insure. It was so shady, in fact, the website for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development conveniently leaves it off the archived document. Here's a snippet of what's removed. Paragraph 228. How race is a defining characteristic of a community. 229 encourages natural or man-made protections like walls against minority communities. 233 verify that incompatible racial groups are not nearby or able to invade an area considered for a higher rating, and how integrated schools would devalue an entire area. This is one of my favorites because it doesn't specify minorities as lower human beings. It just implies higher social classes won't live near an area that could change its racial occupancy, thus lowering its value. It's the classic, I didn't say it was about race, you did. Yeah, the whole thing is shady AF. So in 1936, as America pushed forward to regain its economy strength, it was building new homes, communities, businesses, and travel all throughout America. There was plenty of room to grow new communities, but that opportunity was rarely, if ever, granted to blacks. They couldn't move into these new white neighborhoods even if they could afford it. Fast forward to today. Here's America's great secret on wealth for the middle class: equity. A large portion of white America can look at redlining as the defining moment their family elevated out of poverty and into the middle class, and what a large portion of black America can look at for how the government kept them in poverty. Today, African American wealth is about 5% of white American wealth, and that's not due to being lazy, crime-ridden, violent, or uneducated. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes, and specifically for this part, the equity in the homes of their parents and grandparents. As housing expanded during the New Deal, entire communities were legally developed for white America. These communities had cheap, affordable housing, cheaper than what they were paying in downtown areas. There were business opportunities supporting these new communities. Even entire industries emerged as the rat race of commuting began. New schools and new hospitals were built. It was the investment of a lifetime. Houses in suburb cities like Daly City, San Francisco, or Levittown in New York might cost around $7,000 or $80,000 today. Homes today can sell for up to $460,000. That's a value increase of $380,000. That's money to invest, send your children to college, retire, start a business, or pass down to future generations. And that is where our biggest current racial gap comes from. In spite of the noise, that one act redlining is what has kept the black community from collectively elevating out of poverty. And are there ways to get out of those situations? Yeah, and I know not everyone has $380,000 at their disposal, but collectively white America had the opportunity. Most used it, some grew from it, some squandered it, but the opportunity was there. And while white America headed for the investment opportunities of the New Deal, black America was left with the crumbling structure of the inner city. And finally, we reached the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968. Can we just sit here a minute and enjoy this moment? Let's go ahead and update our life starting line. Remove Jim Crow and black codes. Separate but equal, poll taxes, redlining, and the Amnesty Act of 1872. All Civil War veterans have passed away by then. Half the steps for roots for modern racism. Bring the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment back up to full. And let's give 2 collective points for the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968. Why 2? Because by the late 1960s, many white Americans, at least enough to get the Civil Rights Acts approved through Congress and the White House, understood that skin color doesn't make a difference. Now you may notice that I left the impacts of Jim Crow, separate but equal, and redlining on there. Why? Well, that's the whole reason for this video. The impacts of those decisions are fully ingrained in today's arguments. The roots of modern racism against the black community hinge on criminality, poverty, education, and a lack of respect for the police, each of which has a governmental policy that created the stereotype. It has nothing to do with culture, upbringing, or personal responsibility. Those can work for or against the system, but they didn't create it, nor can they escape it. As we move forward in time, you'll notice how, for most of us alive today, the themes can be traced back here. If you haven't noticed, there tends to be an ongoing cycle of give and take, and as the 70s and 80s roll around, we're going to see how those fertilized roots of modern racism will start oozing out. Welcome to the war on drugs. It's easy to say the war on drugs is about race. It's easy to look at the data provided from the FBI and other studies and go, see, blacks are more incarcerated. It's also super easy to counter the idea and say, well then don't do drugs. Or look at all that crime in Chicago, that's why police are there. Instead of looking at race, which is easy, we're going to look at how the war on drugs impacts the poor. If you've made it this far, you can understand how former governmental policies have led the black community to, overall, have less income than whites. Thanks to the American Action Forum, let's look at how poor people are disproportionately imprisoned. Nearly half of the 2.2 million Americans incarcerated are people that are a combination of nonviolent drug offenders and people who cannot afford their bail or the fines they've accrued. Adults in poverty are 3 times more likely to be arrested than others. People in poverty, earning much less than the federal poverty level, are 15 times more likely to be charged with a felony, which also carries a longer sentence. Prior to being arrested, 57% of men and 72% of women were living in poverty. Comparatively, the national poverty rate is 11.8%. These individuals are not just more likely to be poor and unemployed, but they were also more likely to grow up in poverty and in neighborhoods with high unemployment. Among nonviolent felony drug offenders, approximately 75% faced bail of $5,000 or more. 58% faced bail of at least $10,000, and those amounts are from 2009. And I can hear you typing now, then don't do drugs. Poverty and drug use perpetuate each other in a vicious cycle. Poverty, as we previously discussed, may have been a result of the lack of equity for your family. Drug abuse may result from poverty as a person uses drugs or alcohol as a way to cope with their financial stresses. And for some, selling drugs may be one of only a few reasonable economic opportunities to financial freedom. Look, I'm not saying selling drugs is their only way out, just that there's risk and reward to everything. A legal job for minimum wage that also requires terrible hours, travel time, and weak benefits may not make sense compared to an easier, illegal option. Anyone who's ever had to reevaluate their career has had similar risk and reward debates. Not necessarily to sell drugs, just the risk and the reward of changing. And the last point. While poverty certainly plays a role in the level of crime in a community, income inequality is actually a better predicator of crime rates. Numerous studies have shown that the greater the inequality, the more crime there will likely be in an area. And what government program mapped out economically segregated areas? Redlining, America's #1 challenge for racism. For our life starting line, after much consideration, the steps that on the surface should go to the war on drugs are really already there. They're buried in the impacts of redlining and the residue of stereotypes from Jim Crow and separate but equal. As much as I want to give this an extra advantage, it's a result of former government policies, not the cause. How racial tension got to this point among Americans is a complicated journey. For a good portion of our history, it was written within our laws. America needed the South, so slavery stayed. The North retaliated against the South, so equality was forced. And then for a long time, too long, pure revenge hatreds took over. And now that hatred's legacy is rooted in our beliefs. Redlining created the long-term income inequality gap, and that gap drastically matters today. On paper, all Americans have never been more equal than we are right now. If America started today, it could arguably be one of the most equal countries on the planet. But we didn't start today, and we have a history, a dark history that needs to be acknowledged. That dark history reappears every time a police officer kills an unarmed Black American. Why? The police have unfortunately been on the wrong side of this history multiple times. Black America remembers that the original Southern cops were created to hunt slaves. Black America remembers that law enforcement were key members of the KKK and stood by as public lynchings happened. Black America remembers the fire hoses, attack dogs, batons, and now military equipment. That frustration just builds. And sure, Black people can work hard, stay away from drugs, get an education, and try to purchase a home, and many will. Heck, Black conservatives will argue how Black people should stop acting like victims. But that mentality among both those Black conservatives and white Americans completely ignores the facts we've just discussed. Currently, the Black community as a whole is a direct victim of redlining. To this day, there's been no formal measure to bridge the gap. So how do we solve it, and what can you do to help? Well, let's bring up our life starting line one final time. In America's reality of today, the loss of equity due to redlining and the reminiscence of Jim Crow era racism caused Black America to start life 3 steps behind white America. And white America, as the majority, we hold the cards to the solution. That's not blame, it's the power of being the majority. Changing the impact of modern racism isn't hard. All white America has to do is go, yes, I understand wealth inequality, police brutality, and sentencing are problems for the Black community. Let's work on correcting those. Simple. Listen and improve. That alone knocks that off. As for redlining, that one's much tougher. Of all the things I'll pretend to know how to solve, redlining is not one of them. Due to the previously mentioned wealth gap and the ongoing economics gaps of today, the home ownership gap between whites and Blacks is wider today than in 1968 when discrimination was still legal. Some recommendations for improvement include credit companies' data and technologies better accounting for racial disparities, rent payments, as well as phone and utility bills being considered in all credit assessments. Another, and conservative butts will pucker at the idea, but stronger banking regulations for loans towards minorities. These are starts, but how do you specifically help? Elect politicians that have empathy and understand that equity, not skin color, violence, laziness, lack of respect, or education, but equity is the root issue. And while slogans like Black Lives Matter, No Justice, No Peace, Blue Lives Matter, and All Lives Matter are catchy in the moment, so much more has gone into the history. We can solve this if we just make politics more about us. Thanks for watching.